From the New Testament. We'll be reading from the book of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. Mark 12, 28 through 34. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." "Well said, teacher," the man replied. "You are right in saying that God is one, and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions.
Like everybody and everything was just kind of taking a chunk out of you. By that, what I mean is that there's almost every contact that you have with people, somebody says or does something that just kind of digs into you or frustrates you, or and it just kind of seems to happen sometimes that it's one right after the other. When you look at Mark 12, you find a very interesting series of events, and we don't have time to look at the whole chapter. And so we're not going to try to do that, but I want to try to set this up for you a little bit. Because as the chapter begins, we have Jesus telling a parable of the tenants. And it's a parable about how a landowner rented out his farm to some people who didn't want to pay their rent. And so he sends his servants, the prophets, to collect the rent. And the tenants mistreat and beat the servants. And so the landowner says, "Well, I'll send my son. Surely they'll respect my son." And they kill him. And I think it's in Matthew's account that Matthew says, as Jesus kind of dialogues with the crowd that's listening, says, what would the landowner do? What should he do? And basically it's like, beat them right out of existence and reclaim the land. And Jesus says, "So the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and be given to a nation producing fruit." And we're told that the crowd that was gathered there didn't like especially the religious leaders. Next, there's the question that is put up by Pharisees and the Herodians. The Herodians were a political party, not a religious one. They were sympathizers to the Herods and the Romans. The Pharisees and the Herodians didn't like each other, and they didn't get along, but they both didn't like Jesus. And so they come to him to ask him a question about paying taxes for Caesar. To Caesar. Basically, you can kind of understand how that might work, is that nobody likes paying taxes to anybody, right? But the Jewish people really dislike paying taxes to Caesar. And so they tried to trap Jesus with that. And then some Sadducees come up with a question about marriage and the resurrection. They set up this hypothetical situation of one spouse surviving several others. And so in the resurrection, who's going to be married to who? And Jesus says, I kind of have a mental image here, and I have to credit Jesus with having a whole lot more restraint and self-control than I do, because I probably would have looked at them and rolled my eyes and slapped my forehead and said, how stupid could you get? But Jesus points out the fact that, there's no marriage in the resurrection, and you know that. And so, as you think about it, that through all of these different events, there are different parties, different groups of people who are getting more and more upset that there's a movement stirring up against what I would call a hidden agenda. It's not really so hidden, but it's pointed out. Because after the parable of the tenants, it says that they started trying to find a way to arrest Jesus. The Pharisees and Herodians, similarly, are extremely angry with Jesus, and the Sadducees are really frustrated. It notes that the Pharisees, and I suspect the Pharisees are kind of smugly sitting there laughing at how Jesus has shot down the Sadducees. And so we find that there's one man there, an expert in the law, who has been listening to this and has been listening how Jesus especially has refuted and answered the Sadducees. And so now he wants to raise a question. And it's a really interesting question. It's what is the most important commandment? It's what is the first commandment? And it's an interesting question because you can think from a Jewish perspective that there might be many, it's like, okay, which of the 10 commandments would be the most important, Or which of the traditions might be most important? You think of all of the things that they have been caught up in. And Jesus answers with a quote from Deuteronomy 6, which is what the Jewish people refer to as the Shema meaning hear, because it begins with the words, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength." And I wonder if that was the answer that this Pharisee was expecting. Because you think back to what's been happening in the chapter, different people have been trying to trip up Jesus. If this was, I suspect that this was in some way a loaded question. And that's kind of why I started with the thought, when you've got people who, just one right after the other, are trying to set you up and trying to get you to make a mistake so they can jump on you. And so Jesus answers, the Pharisee is going to observe wisely. And the second part of the answer is Leviticus 19, verse 18. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. By the way, if you go back and look at 19:18, the first part of the verse talks about revenge and carrying a grudge. And then you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the Pharisee has to say, "Well said, teacher." Not just right answer, good answer. That's what we need to understand. And that's what we need to do, because that is the heart of the law. That you can't reduce the law, as might be understood in the Jewish faith in the first century. You can't reduce the law to a set of commandments. You know, it's like you can't reduce Christianity to a set of rules. Thou shalt not, you know. And yet so many people over the years have tried to do that. Let's make a little checklist and no, the beginning point is God. So without getting God into the right place, that nothing else is ever going to work. And so the beginning point is that in the Shema, and the first and greatest commandment, as Jesus states it, is that you shall, that there is only one God. There are no other gods. You know, there are things that people worship. There are things that they give their lives for that are futile and empty and dead end. But for the believer, God is first, always. There is no second. There is no rival. Jesus said you can't serve two masters. You can't divide your loyalty. And so loving God is the most important. This is not just an affectionate love. You know, sometimes people like to have this really emotional thing for God. You know, it's a commitment kind of love. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. And so the Pharisee says to Jesus, you answered wisely. And I wonder for him, as he's part of that group that's trying to trip up Jesus, if something might be stuck in his throat right here. You know, you think about it. He has had to admit that Jesus gave a good answer and a wise answer. And then Jesus responds to him by saying, you're not far from the kingdom of God. It's interesting, Jesus doesn't say he's there. But with the kind of thinking that he has, he's close. That he understands the nature of God's kingdom. The nature of what it is to really be a follower of God, a believer, and ultimately to be a disciple of Jesus. It's what I want to call kingdom loyalty. You know, that if God is truly first in our lives, then that means that loyalty, I mean, okay, let's take an example here. Okay, think about marriage, okay? When we got married, not you and me, but you know, we all got married. We usually, in the vows, say something along the lines that promises to live faithfully with one another as long as we both live, right? And how do you think it would play out if you went back to your spouse and said, well, you know, I wasn't really loyal to you today. Oh? You think you got a problem? Why? Because the expectation of what we would call a covenant loyalty is absolute faithfulness. That we make that relationship the number one of our lives. So when we do that in marriage, but what about with our relationship with God? God is more than a figurehead or a token in our lives. Now, I think we can understand that a little bit if I can kind of tread on something a little bit. You know, as I was thinking about this, I thought, do I really want to go here? All right. Let's talk about the Queen for a second. One of the things that we hear about, and there are many references to the idea, is that the way that the political structure has developed in Great Britain and into the Commonwealth nations that are under the Queen is that ultimately now the Queen is a figurehead, right? She's not going to go outside Buckingham Palace and make a pronouncement that is law throughout the kingdom. She has no authority to do that anymore, right? She can't say, I don't like so-and-so, and off with his head. As much as she might like to with someone. She's a figurehead. She's a symbolic head of state. Yes, she has a position. Yes, she has a title. Technically, every law that's passed by Parliament in Canada must be ratified by her representative in Canada. But bottom line is, she doesn't have that any authority to make law or to enforce law. But that's not the kind of king that God is. God is sovereign. God is absolute. God is in the first place over all of the creation. And so Jesus told his hearers in a number of different ways, that it boils down to what he said in the Sermon on the Mount. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. That's the place and that's the point that he must be. In the model prayer, what many refer to as the Lord's Prayer, Jesus included this line, thy kingdom come, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I think we need to understand that the idea of the kingdom of God on earth is that place, which is not a geographical place, but that place where God's will rules. Now we understand that in a physical sense, in the universe, God's will rules, regardless. But in the affairs of human beings, we're pretty stubborn and obstinate and independent and disobedient. And so, among the majority of human beings, God's will is not ruling. They are not following. They're not even interested in God's will. But among God's people, God's will, his word, must have first place. But it's interesting to think about, because a lot of people, when you say kingdom, they think in a geographical sense and they want to identify a place. And in Luke 17, Jesus says, well, the kingdom's not coming with signs to be observed. It's not going to be, you're not going to be able to say, oh, look, here it is, or there it is. He said, the kingdom is within you. That God's kingdom, God's rule, God's reign is within the heart. And that's where the Pharisee was really kind of understanding. The place that loving God really would have in people's life. Paul said in Colossians 1, and just a wonderful passage, that God has delivered us from the dominion of darkness and transferred us, or brought us into the kingdom of his Son, whom he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. That where the Pharisee was going but wasn't quite there yet, he's not far. He's close. But he hasn't quite made it. And that kind of lies the problem. Is that he hasn't really found the kingdom, but he's kind of playing around the edges of it as he realizes that serving God is not about the animal sacrifices, which the Pharisee himself mentions. It's not about the rituals. It's about the relationship. One of the things that oftentimes we find is that there are many people who have a very sincere desire for God. They want to know God. They want to love God. They want to follow God and serve him. But in many ways, they don't have him in first place. They don't really love him because he's not number one. I mean, think about it. What are the demands that we have in our lives for our attention, for our priorities, for our affection, for our time? And you start thinking about, there's things like work are kind of at the top of the list, but there's a lot of other things. you know, most people, number one, is self. That's why Jesus said, if anyone's going to come after me, let him, what? Deny himself. Take up his cross and follow me. So as we close this morning, when I have to really think about the question about where we stand with God, where you stand with God. Is he first in your life? Maybe are you one of those that has a lot of really good intention, but you're like the Pharisee. You're not far from the kingdom. But you haven't quite come the rest of the way. Glenn has chosen a song for us to close with, and as we sing this song, hopefully you'll be thinking about your relationship with God. And if there's some way that we can help you with that, you can make that known to us. You can talk with me or one of the other elders after we're through. Let's stand as we sing.